How does a man rule the world while his body decays from the toes up? Versailles never spoke of it, but in the last summer of Louis XIV's life, the most glorious palace in Europe reeked of rot. Behind a door guarded night and day, the Sun King no longer stood tall in marble courtyards. He lay still in a silk-draped bed, leg blackened, tissue splitting, veins pulsing with poison. His foot had turned to gangrene, his bones were dissolving, and yet he was still called Majesty. Candles burned beside him, not for ceremony, but to mask the stench of death. Courtiers brought him reports of wars, colonies, marriages, and treaties, while quietly stepping back, for fear the smell would cling to their robes. His eyes were glassy, his mouth dry, but his command endured. Ministers bowed low. No one dared mention the color of his skin or the sound his body made when touched. It was no longer human. He ruled to the end. That was the tragedy and the triumph. For decades, Europe knelt before his name. But when the flesh rebelled, when the body he had dressed in gold turned against him, no army could intervene. His kingdom could not stop the rot. Not even God did. This is the story of a man who died before he stopped breathing. A man whose legacy is built on palaces, paintings, and pain. A man who became a corpse in real time, wearing a crown that could not save his skin. This is how the Sun King rotted alive. He came into the world not as a child, but as a prophecy. Louis XIV, the long-awaited son of France, was called the gift of God. The bells of Notre Dame rang for him. Nobles wept openly at his birth. He was not just a boy. He was the salvation of a kingdom haunted by miscarriages, bloodlines at risk, and the looming fear that heaven had abandoned its throne on earth. His father, King Louis XIII, was distant, sickly, and emotionally void. His mother, Anne of Austria, clung to her son as to a divine answer. France had held its breath for decades, and now, here was the heir wrapped in lace and incense. But joy never lasts long in royal halls. When Louis XIII died, the boy was only 4. The crown passed to his head, but not yet to his hands. The kingdom turned to his mother, and behind her, to a cardinal. Cardinal Mazarin became the unseen hand, the whisperer in corridors, the shadow behind the regent. He taught the young king to observe everything and trust no one. Louis was made to understand early that a king must stand alone, that the throne was not inherited, but seized each day through silence, performance, and will. He watched the court with a child's eyes and remembered everything. He saw how ministers smiled at his mother and mocked her behind closed doors. He saw nobles drink to loyalty and plot against the crown by night. He fled Paris when mobs rose, heard the thunder of violence outside bedroom walls, and slept with fear under velvet blankets. What the world gave him in power, it stole back in peace. Those who thought the boy would grow into a gentle king misunderstood the lessons carved into his youth. By the time he turned 22, Mazarin was dead, and the court expected the usual appointment of a new minister. But Louis gave no one the seat. Instead, he looked them all in the eye and said the words that rewrote monarchy in France. "I am the state." The room froze. No one had expected it. Not from a king so young, not from a voice so calm. But in that moment, the air shifted. A line was drawn between what came before and what would never return. Louis XIV began to build a kingdom where he would never again be humiliated. Versailles was not simply constructed as a palace. It was an answer to his childhood. Every marble column, every gilded frame, every reflecting mirror was a way to tame chaos, a world in which no one could hide behind shadows, because all things were illuminated by him. The sun did not tolerate the night. He surrounded himself with obedience. Ritual became law. Each morning, nobles arrived before sunrise just to witness him wake. The king's rising was a spectacle of hierarchy. One handed him his shirt, another his shoes. Each gesture became a privilege. Every second near him was a chance to be seen, to be remembered, to survive. And yet, he never raised his voice. He never begged for loyalty. He made loyalty inevitable. Those who opposed him were not destroyed with fury, but erased with silence. Their names disappeared from ledgers. Their faces vanished from portraits. Their power simply evaporated. France began to mirror his image. Art bloomed under his gaze. Literature found its muse in his reign. Architecture bent to his vision. Ministers who once plotted for influence now measured their lives by how close they stood to the king during supper. Even God seemed quieter in churches than in his halls. But what the world praised, he internalized. He began to believe what everyone else had to pretend, that his rule was not just absolute, but divine, that the order he created was perfect, that the body which carried that order could not fail him. His heartbeat was France. His breath was law. His flesh, untouched by ordinary weakness. That belief would cost him everything. It was not enough for Louis XIV to reign. He needed the world to see it, to feel it, to inhale it with every breath. At Versailles, nothing moved unless he allowed it. From the sound of a fountain to the curve of a garden hedge, everything had been arranged to reflect one truth. He was the center. He was the axis around which France revolved. Others ruled by decree. Louis ruled by presence. He walked slowly, purposefully, not because age had claimed him, but because the world would wait. In the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection multiplied. It marched beside him in silence. Courtiers bowed as he passed, but none dared to look him in the eyes unless invited. Each glance from him was a transaction, each word a currency more powerful than gold. Under his gaze, France changed. Wars were declared without hesitation. Fortresses rose, maps shifted. Enemies fell not only in battlefields but in salons, where alliances were whispered over wine and decided before the ink dried. He strengthened the army until it thundered across Europe. His generals feared him more than the enemy. Not because he screamed, but because he expected victory as if it were the weather. He reshaped religion to suit the crown. The Edict of Nantes, which had once protected Protestants, was revoked. He believed unity came only through control, and control demanded sacrifice. Churches were seized. Families were exiled. France became Catholic not only in faith but in command. Dissent was not sin. It was treason. But while he conquered outside, he also conquered within. His court became the theater of power. Nobles once armed with swords were now armed with etiquette. They studied his moods like scripture. A missed bow, an overlong gaze, A misplaced compliment could end a career. Duels were replaced with glances. Rebellion replaced with gossip. Versailles became a golden cage, and everyone inside sang praises just to breathe. He married not once, but twice. The first union, with Maria Theresa of Spain, secured political peace. The second, secret and scandalous, was with Madame de Maintenon, a woman of wit and piety who whispered to him of God and mortality. Yet even love was structured. Even affection was choreographed. Nothing in his world escaped ceremony. And still, he stood tall. Portraits show him in armor, in silk, in robes heavy with embroidery. He held the scepter not with pride, but with destiny. To question his rule was to question order itself. For decades, he succeeded. The people adored him. Foreign courts envied him. His name was sung in poems and prayers. Yet no one noticed that he had begun to walk less, that the throne was raised higher each year, that his steps, once measured, had grown careful. Something had entered the orbit, something not designed by architects or painted by royal hands. It began quietly, with a pain that refused to leave. He mentioned it only once, in passing, after a long day of court meetings and diplomatic letters. A stiffness in the leg, a small discomfort after the hunt. Nothing unusual, nothing that warranted concern. Not yet. The pain returned the following morning, then every morning after that. But Versailles did not pause for weakness. The curtains still parted. The servants still waited. The rituals demanded movement, even when each step grew heavier than the last. He adjusted his stance at the mirror. He placed more weight on the right leg. He ordered longer cloaks, more ornate shoes, layers of silk that could conceal a hesitation. But the body cannot lie forever. At a distance, he remained unchanged. The sun still glinted off his rings. His voice still carried across marble halls. But up close, those who dared approach saw something different. A flicker in the eyes, a twitch in the jaw, a hand gripping the armrest a second longer than usual. Whispers began, silent at first, like wind behind drapes. Was the king tired? Had he taken ill? But no one spoke too loud. To notice the weakness of the king was to question the state, and France had no room for weakness. To distract from what could not be denied, he poured himself further into policy. The War of Spanish Succession dragged on, a brutal game of blood and borders. Tens of thousands died in his name. France strained under the cost, but Louis stood firm. He could not appear fragile. Not to his court, not to his enemies, not even to himself. He summoned ambassadors, signed declarations, reviewed troops, but behind the closed doors of his chambers, the boots came off. The leg was swollen, the pain sharp. Ministers waited outside for hours, while physicians prodded gently, muttering prayers beneath their breath. The king refused to rest. He refused to relinquish control. Pain, he believed, could be mastered the same way he had mastered rebellion, religion, and war. Through silence, through endurance, through sheer will. But pain is not a courtier. It does not obey ritual. It does not bow to majesty. The man who once commanded empires now limped between rooms. The sun, it seemed, had begun to flicker. The walls of Versailles had never been this silent. Music still played in the gardens, Dinners were still served with silver and laughter. But inside the royal apartments, the light dimmed. The king no longer walked the halls. The king no longer appeared at the opera. The king no longer moved without help. Those closest to him knew, but none dared speak. His physicians, once proud men of science, had become a council of whispers. They argued behind velvet curtains. Some claimed it was sciatica. Others suspected a clot. A few, the boldest among them, had begun to murmur a word that chilled the spine. Gangrene, a word no one wanted to say aloud in a palace built on beauty. Still, the rituals continued, even as the king writhed in his bed with a leg that throbbed like a drum, even as the sheets were changed twice a day to hide the stains, even as the windows were opened wider, not for air, but to chase away the growing stench. The court adapted, as it always had. Ministers delivered reports while looking straight ahead, avoiding the sight of the king's twisted foot beneath the blankets. Courtiers no longer competed to hand him his gloves. The path to power shifted again, away from the sick room, toward those who controlled access to it. Madame de Maintenon, once a quiet presence at his side, became a gatekeeper. She read aloud when he could no longer see clearly. She decided who was allowed to visit, and in that narrowing circle of trust, politics began to fester. Some feared the king's death would bring chaos. Others saw it as opportunity. Each day he survived was both a blessing and a delay. Plans were drawn. Letters were written in invisible ink. Eyes turned toward the Dauphin, the heirs, the generals. Each wondered who would rise when the crown finally fell. Outside Versailles, rumors began to escape. Merchants spoke of a smell that clung to those returning from court. A bishop in Lyon preached about decay in high places. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages back to their kings. The sun was dimming. They wrote, "France may not last the winter." Yet inside the palace, denial reigned. The king himself refused to surrender authority. He met with the Council of State from a padded chair, sweat beading on his brow. He spoke slowly now. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, forgetting the point, but he still signed decrees, still issued commands, still held the center. No one contradicted him, not to his face, but behind the mirrors and the chandeliers. Versailles had begun to split in two. One half still bowed to the illusion, the other prepared for what came next. On paper, Louis XIV remained invincible. His royal seal appeared on letters. His voice echoed through council halls. His portrait still hung untouched in every chamber. But in the minds of those who walked Versailles, the man was already becoming a shadow. Every movement within the court was now calculated not around loyalty, but survival. Old alliances were tested. Eyes once filled with admiration shifted to watch each other. The courtiers did not speak of death, but they dressed for it. Mourning cloaks were prepared in secret. Carriages were ordered without explanation. The palace had become a quiet theater of anticipation. The physicians, after weeks of disagreement, finally reached a conclusion. The king's leg was dying. The skin was no longer just darkened. It had begun to crack. The flesh was soft, damp, and separating from the bone. Each time they unwrapped the bandages, the room filled with a metallic odor no incense could hide. A decision had to be made. 4 surgeons from the Faculty of Medicine in Paris were summoned. Their arrival was swift, but their permission to act was delayed. No one wanted to be the first to cut. No one wanted to bear the guilt if the king's heart gave out on the table. For days, they examined, debated, and argued. Meanwhile, the rot advanced. Madame de Maintenon forbade any mention of amputation in the king's presence. The word itself was considered dangerous. She insisted on prayers. She called for novenas, for relics, for miracles. But prayers cannot halt gangrene, and God, if he listened, remained silent. Inside the council, power began to slip through fingers. Each minister knew that the future depended on who acted first, who positioned themselves as the next voice behind the throne. Letters were burned. Deals were made in gardens. Servants were bribed. Versailles, for all its gold and grace, had become a nest of watching eyes and quiet betrayal. Still, the people outside the gates knew little. The king's condition was a secret guarded with the same intensity as a military plan. Declarations were sent to Paris affirming his strength. Paintings of him were still commissioned. Sermons still praised his endurance. But inside the palace, even the most loyal had begun to avoid the smell that crept beneath the doors. One morning, a young servant fainted while entering the royal chamber. The physicians claimed it was fatigue. The truth was simpler. She had never encountered the scent of human flesh giving way. By the end of August, the king could no longer walk. The pain in his leg had become a storm that moved through his blood, pulsing against every nerve. His foot had gone cold. The blackness had crept up past the ankle, reaching toward the knee with a hunger that no remedy could stop. Gangrene was no longer a word whispered behind doors. It was now the king's closest companion. He lay in a bed that had once been the center of ritual. Now it was the center of decay. The sheets had to be changed 3 times a day. The bandages bled through before the physicians could unwrap them. The skin on his leg peeled in strips, revealing flesh so gray it no longer resembled anything living. The stench rose with each hour, sour and metallic, thicker than the perfume that once floated through the halls. Every movement became a battle. Turning from one side to the other required 2 men and a whispered prayer. His breathing grew shallow. His lips cracked. Food no longer tempted him. Wine made him gag. His hands, once firm with gesture and command, trembled without cause. The fire in his eyes dimmed. And still, he ruled. Ministers continued to enter the room each day, bowing deeply before speaking, as if nothing had changed. They read reports aloud while avoiding the sight of the leg beneath the silk cover. Sometimes he responded. Sometimes he simply stared past them, eyes unfocused, lips moving without sound. When the physicians suggested draining the wound again, the king refused. His voice, now hoarse, cut through the silence with finality. He had endured worse. He claimed he would endure this. But endurance has limits. The infection had spread into the marrow. His thigh began to swell. Purple blotches appeared on his abdomen. The body was surrendering, piece by piece. His pulse quickened, then faltered, then quickened again. At night, he would cry out in Latin, sometimes reciting prayers, sometimes shouting orders to long-dead generals. Sleep no longer came in hours, but in broken minutes. He sweated through every layer of clothing. His pillow had to be replaced daily. His fingertips went blue, And through it all, no one spoke of death, not in the chamber, not in the council. To acknowledge it would be to strip away the myth. To say the Sun King was dying would be to admit the sun could fall. The silence surrounding him became heavier than the walls themselves. Servants who once smiled with pride when entering his chamber now kept their eyes on the floor. They moved quickly, mechanically, as if afraid the air might cling to their lungs. Some refused to speak at all. A few were quietly replaced. Others asked to be reassigned to distant wings of the palace. The ones who remained did so out of loyalty or fear. Often both. The king's leg had become unrecognizable, no longer a limb. It looked more like a burnt log left too long in a dying fire. The flesh had separated from the bone. Beneath the surface, a gray liquid oozed with each shift of weight. The odor filled the corridor. Even closed doors could not contain it. No one touched the leg unless commanded. When the physicians were summoned to clean the wound, they wore cloth over their faces. Still, several of them vomited afterward. A royal guard stationed at the entrance collapsed after one shift, claiming the smell had begun to follow him into dreams. Louis spoke less. When he did, it was in fragments. He would mention treaties, battles, names of distant cities. Sometimes he addressed courtiers who were no longer alive. He called for his brother, for his mother, for Cardinal Mazarin. His voice softened, became thinner, as though stretched too far from the source. At times, he begged for God. At others, he denied him. Madame de Maintenon remained beside him, holding a rosary that trembled in her hands. She read scripture into the hollow space that had once echoed with commands. She wiped his forehead with cloth dipped in rosewater. But no water could cool the fever now. The infection had entered his bloodstream. His organs began to fail in quiet rebellion. His skin lost its warmth. Blisters formed at the base of his spine. His breath rasped, as if each one had to be pulled from the bottom of a well. And yet, no one declared mourning. The bells did not ring. The banners remained bright. Versailles still performed its rituals as if nothing had changed. But behind every gesture, behind every forced smile, there was one shared thought. The king is dying, and he is dying in pieces. The morning of September 1st arrived with no sound. There were no bells, no footsteps running across the marble floors of Versailles. The fountains still played their rehearsed melody in the gardens. The sun filtered through the clouds, but refused to shine with confidence. Inside the king's bedchamber, the air had thickened overnight. It carried not only the scent of illness, but the weight of inevitability. Louis XIV had not spoken since the evening before. His mouth had dried, cracked at the corners. His hands rested limply on his chest, still adorned with rings that no longer fit snugly. His eyes, once sharp enough to freeze entire rooms, stared into nothing. He no longer reacted to voices. Not to his attendants, not to his doctors, not to Madame de Maintenon, whose presence had never left his side. She sat in silence now, eyes fixed on the edge of the bed. Her prayers had faded into breathless watching. The rosary lay still in her lap. She had whispered scripture for hours, then fell quiet, as though words had lost their power. The physicians had done everything they could. They had drained the leg, reopened the wound, applied vinegar compresses, and tried to stimulate circulation with hot cloths. None of it mattered. The gangrene had won. It had risen past the thigh. The blackness had consumed him from within. There was no part of his body left untouched by infection, not even his heartbeat, which now thudded irregularly in the hollow of his chest. At the foot of the bed stood the heir, only 10 years old. Dressed in ceremonial blue, he had been instructed to watch. This was how a king left the world, not in battle, not in glory, but in silence. The boy's eyes were wide, his fingers clenched at his sides. No one explained the smell. No one told him what he would carry for the rest of his life from this single hour. The priest murmured the final rites again, though they had already been spoken the day before. The body still breathed, and so the soul had not yet left. He dabbed the holy oil onto the king's forehead, which burned with fever. His voice trembled as he spoke. This moment had been rehearsed many times, but never with a man whose leg had already begun to decay before death. Then, just after the 8th hour, the breath stopped. No one moved. The priest lowered his hand. Madame de Maintenon leaned forward and pressed her palm gently to the king's chest. Nothing. The physicians stepped closer, but they did not need to speak. It was over. Louis XIV had died without a final word, without a last command. The man who had ruled for 72 years passed not with thunder, but with a whisper. One last breath, and then stillness. Not even the candle beside the bed flickered. A servant outside the door wept into his sleeve. Inside, no one made a sound. The body remained for a long moment, untouched. Then, with slow precision, the physicians began their work. The sheets were removed. The stench grew stronger. The gangrene had spread beyond the hip. The flesh along the abdomen had turned a deep, unnatural purple. The left foot had already collapsed into its own fluids. Linen stuck to open sores. Every touch released a new wave of odor. A mortuary attendant stepped in with gloves and clean cloths. They had prepared for this. Ceremonial robes were laid out across the table. Silk, gold thread, buttons carved from ivory, the shoes that had been crafted to match the throne room's marble. It took 3 men to lift the body. One held the torso, another supported the leg, now brittle and wet. The last guided the limbs into the robes with practiced care. They wrapped the foot in extra linen, not to preserve dignity, but to prevent it from falling apart. They applied powder to the face, smoothing the lines with soft brushes. The lips were pressed closed, the eyes fixed. A gold cross was placed between the fingers. From a distance, it almost looked like a statue. Almost, but the smell remained. Rose water was poured generously beneath the bed. Candles were relit. The windows were cracked. Still, the chamber held the scent of a body that had surrendered days before the heart had. As the attendants stepped back, the doors opened. The court entered in silence. Ministers, generals, clergy, noblemen with silver hair and downcast eyes. They bowed not in awe, but in the recognition of what had happened. The Sun King was gone, and the body he left behind had betrayed the myth. No one mentioned the leg. No one looked at the linen stains. Their eyes stayed fixed on the face, painted now with stillness, preserved like the palace itself. In the hall of mirrors, the light shifted. Dozens of reflections stared back at themselves. Outside, the fountains continued to rise and fall in perfect rhythm. But something had broken. The man who believed himself eternal had become what all men become: mortal. Versailles did not mourn like the rest of the world. It adjusted. It rearranged tapestries. It changed seating orders. It cleaned the walls. Behind the marble and gold, behind the operas and torchlit processions, the palace exhaled quietly. The myth had ended. The man was gone, and the odor he left behind lingered longer than the memory of his voice. The court followed protocol. A week of silence, banners stitched with black thread, speeches recited with trembling voices. But the servants who had entered the king's chamber during those final days knew something deeper. They whispered it behind closed doors, in kitchens, in corridors where mirrors did not reach. The Sun King had rotted alive. The perfume had failed. The crown had meant nothing to the gangrene. His body was sealed in 3 coffins: wood, then lead, then oak, not to honor him, but to contain what had begun long before the heart stopped. They buried him at Saint-Denis, as they had all the kings. But no monument could cleanse what had happened to his flesh: the blackened foot, the splitting skin, the mask of powder brushed over decay. That was the true tomb, hidden beneath velvet and anthem. The people came to see the funeral procession. They cried as instructed. They prayed as expected. But their voices did not echo like they once had. France was tired. The wars had taken too much. The taxes had broken too many backs. The theater of royalty had lost its illusion. And now, their immortal king had proven himself made of the same failing muscle and blood as everyone else. No paintings were ever commissioned of the final days. No tapestry showed the foot beneath the linens. No statue sculpted the swollen thigh, the stiffening hand, the moment when silence won. History remembered him as the builder of Versailles, the warrior, the son. But the bed where he died was burned, the sheets destroyed, the walls washed 5 times. And yet, in the minds of those who had stood near that bed, the truth was never erased. A century later, when revolution came, they opened the royal tombs. What they found was not majesty, not light, not divine lineage. What they found was rot. The lead coffins had sweated from within. Bones swam in black liquid. Fabric clung to bone like wet leaves. The Sun King, even in death, had not escaped the darkness he tried so long to outshine. And yet, the story lives. Not the one Versailles carved in stone, but the one buried in silence. The one whispered by those who lit the final candles. The one left behind in a chamber where roses could not mask the truth. The one held not by statues or oil portraits, but by the walls that had heard him gasp, by the floorboards that held the weight of his last breath, by the air that never fully cleared. This is how power ends. Not with glory, but with a foot that splits open in the night, with servants who cannot speak, with doctors who wash their hands in rosewater and leave the room backward. This is how the myth of immortality dies. And now you have seen it. The last days of a man who believed himself to be the sun, the decay behind the curtain, the silence beneath the crown. If this truth reached you, let it remain. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. Let the throne remember, even when the world wants to forget.